Breaking news from the Gulf. A major escalation is now unfolding in the United Arab Emirates after officials said they intercepted a number of missile strikes from Iran while a large fire erupted at a petroleum facility in the port city of Fujairah. This is not just another warning shot. The UAE has now confirmed an Iranian drone strike sparked the fire at an oil facility in the Emirate of Fujairah, pushing the conflict into one of the Gulf's most sensitive energy zones. And that changes the stakes immediately. Because Fujairah is not just a port city, it is a critical petroleum hub, a strategic energy lifeline, and now the latest point of impact in a crisis moving faster than governments can contain. Missiles were intercepted. A drone got through. A petroleum facility caught fire. And Tuesday, the 5th of May, 2026, a day that was supposed to follow one script, has now become the opening scene of something far more dangerous. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was supposed to walk into the United Nations Security Council chamber in New York, table a draft resolution, and tell the world that the United States was bringing the full weight of international law to bear on the Strait of Hormuz crisis. The resolution demanded that Iran stop its attacks on shipping. It demanded that Iran disclose the number and location of every sea mine it had planted in the world's most critical energy corridor. It demanded that a humanitarian corridor be opened. It demanded that Iran engage meaningfully in negotiations. For more than 2 months, innocent sailors and commercial crew members had been stranded at sea because Iran was carrying out something that was not merely criminal, but also destructive and strategically ruthless. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Rubio stood at a podium and delivered that statement with the calm authority of a man who believed the institution behind him still meant something. And then, within hours of that statement landing, Iran struck the United Arab Emirates again. Drone strikes, missile strikes. A fire at the Fujairah oil industry zone on the UAE coast, the same UAE that had already been hit in prior days. The same UAE that hosts American military assets. The same UAE that was supposed to be protected by the very security framework Rubio was invoking when he walked into that chamber and asked the United Nations to act. The resolution did not stop a single Iranian missile. The draft language did not intercept a single drone. And the chamber that is supposed to represent the collective authority of the international community to prevent exactly this kind of escalation watched it happen in real time, from a distance, with no ability to stop it. That is not a diplomatic setback. That is a structural exposure. And what it reveals about the institutions the United States has spent decades building, funding, and invoking as legitimacy for its own foreign policy is something every government watching this war from a distance is already calculating privately, even if no one is saying it out loud in the briefing rooms. In the next few minutes, I want to walk through 3 receipts that document exactly what happened in the 48 hours surrounding that Security Council moment. I want to show you why Iran's decision to strike the UAE on the same day Rubio tabled his resolution was not a coincidence, not a miscommunication, and not a simple battlefield improvisation. I want to show you what the gap between Washington's institutional response and Iran's operational reality tells us about who is actually setting the terms of this conflict on day 67, and I want to show you where this goes from here. Because the fragile ceasefire that has technically been held since April 7th is now being tested in ways that every senior official following this conflict recognizes as the most dangerous stretch of the entire war. Think about it like this. You have a neighbor who keeps breaking into houses on your street. You call the neighborhood association. You draft a formal letter. You present it at the next meeting and ask for a resolution condemning the break-ins and demanding that the neighbor comply with community rules. And while the meeting is still taking place, the same neighbor breaks into the house next door. The letter changes nothing. The resolution changes nothing. Because the neighbor has already concluded that the association has no power to stop him, and he is proving it in real time, in front of everyone watching, so that the entire street understands who actually controls the situation. That is the message Iran sent on Tuesday. When a formal international resolution fails to stop the exact behavior it was written to prevent within hours of being tabled, what does that tell you about the institution that produced it? To understand what Tuesday really meant, you have to go backward. Because to understand Rubio's trip to the Security Council, you need to understand the sequence of events that built up to it and why this outcome was always likely. On Sunday, May 3rd, Donald Trump announced Operation Project Freedom from his golf course in Florida. The message was simple. The United States military would begin guiding ships through the Strait of Hormuz, escorting neutral commercial vessels through a waterway that Iran had kept functionally closed since February 28th. Trump framed it as strength. He framed it as America taking back control of an international waterway. He said the United States would guide stranded ships out. He called it freedom. Within hours, the risks became obvious. Iranian forces opened fire on United States vessels approaching the strait. The United States military responded by destroying 6 Iranian small boats. Iran fired missiles and drones at the UAE. A Fujairah oil facility caught fire. An Emirati drone alert went out. And senior American officials told reporters on the record that the United States was closer to resuming major combat operations than it had been at any point in the previous 24 hours. That is the backdrop against which Rubio walked into the Security Council on May 5th. That is the environment in which the draft resolution was tabled. Not a calm diplomatic initiative from a position of strength, but a desperate institutional move during the most dangerous 4-8-hour window of a 6-7-day conflict that was supposed to last only 4 to 5 weeks. Project Freedom had already been answered with Iranian fire. The ceasefire was already bleeding. And the response from the world's most powerful deliberative body was, in practical terms, a piece of paper. Now let us get to the 3 receipts. Receipt number 1, what Rubio actually asked for, and why Iran was never going to comply with any of it. The draft resolution Rubio presented to the Security Council had 4 core demands. Iran must cease all attacks on commercial shipping. Iran must disclose the number and precise location of every sea mine it has placed in or near the Strait of Hormuz. Iran must cooperate with international mine-clearing efforts. And Iran must support the establishment of a humanitarian corridor through the strait. Read those demands carefully and consider what they actually mean from Tehran's perspective. Ceasing attacks on commercial shipping is not just a military requirement. It is a demand that Iran surrender its main source of leverage in the current negotiation. The attacks on shipping are the mechanism through which Iran has created economic pain. Oil prices elevated, gasoline in the United States above $4.45 per gallon, and hundreds of tankers stranded inside the Persian Gulf. That is Iran's strongest card at the table. Asking Iran to stop the attacks before a deal is reached is asking Iran to disarm before the negotiation concludes. No government in wartime diplomacy does that voluntarily. The demand to reveal the location of sea mines is even more direct. It asks Iran to remove its own defensive barrier while the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports remains in place, while American warships continue to operate in the strait, and while the ceasefire is being tested day after day by Project Freedom escorts. American officials themselves acknowledge that Iran may have lost track of some of the mines it planted, meaning Tehran cannot fully disclose what it cannot fully locate. So the demand was not only politically unacceptable, it may also have been operationally impossible, even if Iran had wanted to comply. And cooperating with international mine clearance operations would mean allowing foreign naval assets to move freely in waters Iran has declared under its own maritime authority. At the same time Rubio was presenting this resolution, Iran's parliament was discussing legislation that would require all shipping through the strait to pay tolls to the Iranian government. Those positions are not compatible. They are not even part of the same conceptual framework. Iran's response to the resolution came not through secret cables or private back channels, but through the Fujairah drone strike and the continued harassment of vessels attempting to move under Project Freedom protection. That was not an accident. That was the message. Tehran's position, expressed in the same strategic language it has used consistently for 67 days, was simple. Your paper does not change our calculations, and our calculations say the strait remains on our terms. And there is another layer here. The Security Council resolution was never likely to pass in any binding form anyway. Russia and China both have veto power. Both had already signaled positions broadly aligned with Iran's core demand that any real ceasefire arrangement must include a full lifting of the American naval blockade before any final Hormuz framework is accepted. Rubio knew that. His team knew that. The draft was not truly designed to pass. It was designed to create a public record, a diplomatic paper trail establishing the United States as the reasonable actor for the international audience watching. The problem is that the same international audience also watched Iran hit the UAE while the resolution was being tabled. And that audience is drawing its own conclusions about which instruments matter and which do not. Receipt number 2. The 2 ships that are supposed to prove Project Freedom is working, and the 230 that prove it is not. When Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth appeared before cameras on Tuesday and said the ceasefire was not over, he pointed to Project Freedom as evidence that the United States was making progress, reopening the strait. He said Maersk, the world's largest shipping company, had successfully guided one of its vessels through the strait under American military protection. He described it as proof that the United States, not Iran, controls the waterway. He called it a red, white, and blue shield over the Strait of Hormuz. Now place another number beside that single ship. Lambai Sancher. That is the number of loaded oil tankers that the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company chief executive confirmed are still sitting inside the Persian Gulf waiting. 230 vessels, fully loaded, unable to move, burning fuel at anchor, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in cargo and carrying energy supplies on which dozens of countries depend. One Maersk ship made it through. 230 remained waiting. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on television on Monday morning and said the United States had full control over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's state media immediately issued a statement attributed to the IRGC, saying that no commercial vessels or oil tankers had passed through the strait in recent hours, and that American claims were baseless and entirely false. Both statements were on the record. Both were directed at the same international audience. And the markets, which are the most honest, real-time measure of what people actually believe, are pricing in $5 gasoline as, in the words of one senior Eurasia Group analyst, basically baked in. That gap between Bessent's full control and the IRGC's not one tanker, together with the market's $5 signal, is the real space inside which Project Freedom now exists. American officials are not necessarily lying in the simplest sense. The military did escort ships. It did destroy 6 Iranian small boats that threatened those ships. It is operating in the strait. But operating in the strait and controlling the strait are not the same thing. Insurance markets do not respond to rhetoric. They do not respond to 1 or 2 escorted transits. They respond to sustained, demonstrated safety across a full corridor where Iran has already shown it will fire on American warships, lay mines in the approaches, and strike nearby Gulf infrastructure when the political moment demands it. That is the difference between a headline and real control. And that difference is now being priced into everything from oil futures to household energy costs. Receipt number 3. Iran attacked the UAE on the same day Rubio went to the UN. That was not a mistake. That was the point. Senior defense officials confirmed this week that since the ceasefire was announced on April 7th, Iran has attacked commercial vessels 9 times, seized 2 container ships, and engaged United States forces more than 10 times. All of it below the threshold the administration has defined as sufficient to justify a return to major combat operations. All of it was calibrated. All of it is deliberate. The Fujairah strike on Monday, the fire at the UAE oil processing zone, injuries to Indian workers, drone activity in Emirati airspace did not happen because Iranian planners made a battlefield error. It happened because Iranian planners made a political decision. The calculation was clear. Project Freedom begins Monday. Rubio goes to the Security Council Tuesday. The entire international community will be watching the United States try to reassert institutional authority over the Hormuz crisis through international law. Strike the UAE while the resolution is being prepared, and you send a message to every government watching at the same time. That message is simple. The Security Council is a room. We are in the strait. The room cannot reach the strait. You already knew that. Now you have seen it again. Iran's foreign minister delivered his own version of that message this week when he warned that the UAE and the United States should beware of being dragged back into a quagmire. That warning came after the UAE had already been struck. The sequence matters. The strike was a demonstration. The warning was the explanation. And while all of that was happening externally, Iran's internal posture was moving in exactly the opposite direction from what a government preparing to retreat would look like. After weeks of a near-total internet shutdown affecting more than 90 million Iranians, the government launched a domestic campaign called Jan Fada, meaning those who sacrifice their lives for the cause, urging citizens to register as war volunteers through a state website. Armed, state-backed motorcades were seen roaming Tehran at night. Authorities were digging out bombed entrances to underground missile and drone depots in order to restore strike capacity damaged in the early weeks of the war. That is not the posture of a government winding down. That is the posture of a government preparing its population for the possibility that the ceasefire fails and the fighting resumes. At the negotiating table, Iran's one 4-point counterproposal was not a document designed to produce a quick settlement either. It included demands for full war reparations, with one Iranian official citing $270 billion in direct and indirect damages, the withdrawal of United States forces from Iran's periphery, an end to the naval blockade, the release of frozen Iranian assets, the lifting of sanctions, and a new mechanism governing the Strait of Hormuz that explicitly reduces American authority over the waterway. Trump said last week that he was unimpressed by the proposal. That is a diplomatic way of saying something simpler. The two sides are not actually inside the same negotiation. They are holding parallel conversations about two different futures, occasionally passing messages through Pakistani intermediaries. And that is what most analysis still misses. The Security Council resolution and Project Freedom are not two separate initiatives. They are the same initiative expressed through two different channels at the same time. Together, they represent the United States trying to regain control of a situation that has drifted beyond the reach of the very tools Washington built to manage this kind of crisis. The problem is that both tools are revealing their limits simultaneously. Project Freedom can escort two ships through a corridor where 230 tankers are still waiting. International law can draft a resolution that Russia and China will veto, and Iran can strike the UAE, fire on American warships, and continue seizing commercial vessels while remaining technically below the threshold that would automatically restart a major air campaign because it has spent 67 days learning exactly where that threshold is and how to stay just beneath it. This is not random. Iran's strategy since the ceasefire has been extraordinarily precise. Strike hard enough to prove relevance and capability. Stop short of giving Trump the domestic political pretext for full bombing to resume. Keep economic pressure on shipping. Preserve just enough of the ceasefire framework to avoid all-out war. Every strike, every ship seizure, every warning shot has been calibrated against those variables at the same time. The result is a situation American officials are struggling to describe honestly. They cannot say the ceasefire is over, because technically it is not. They cannot say the operation is working, because Iran is striking UAE infrastructure and American-linked shipping, while one Marsk transit is presented as proof of progress. So they fall back on words like fluid, volatile, below threshold, quieter. Those are the words used when a situation no longer fits the categories available to the people trying to explain it. And the Security Council draft resolution lives in exactly that same space of institutional inadequacy. It is a real document, written by real lawyers, presented by a real Secretary of State, inside a real chamber with real procedural authority, and it could not stop a single drone. Not because international law is meaningless, but because international law requires either consent or constraint among the actors it is trying to regulate. And one of those actors has spent 67 days proving that it does not consider itself bound by institutions it did not accept on those terms in the first place. So what does this mean in practical terms? The immediate consumer number is simple. The American average is $4.46 per gallon. Before the war began on February 28th, it was $2.98. That is a 49% increase in 67 days. But that is the lagging indicator. The leading indicator is this: 230 loaded tankers at anchor. Insurance premiums are so high that many operators will not move without military escort. A shipping ecosystem that has already begun rerouting contracts, rewriting supply chains, and building alternative sourcing relationships over these 67 days. Those structural changes do not disappear because someone drafts a resolution or announces a ceasefire. They begin hardening into a new commercial reality. That means if $5 gasoline arrives, it does not automatically go back to $3 because someone signs a paper in Oman. Prices only normalize when the structural disruption ends and supply relationships are rebuilt. That takes time, months, not days. And that is the deeper reality this crisis is exposing.